Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection, for a very, very informative show today. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. If you are joining by radio, please know that all our shows are Facebook Live on AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. The topic today, democracy in the voting process, democracy in the voting process. I'm sure you remember that the first Thursday of every month, and starting in 2020, it will be the first Tuesday of every month, we are addressing issues under the theme of democracy. And let me remind you that Abraham Lincoln said that democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So we're following this theme in view of the 2020 presidential elections. We'll be doing this through the elections. So join us in this ride, so to speak. We have a special guest today. Our guest is none other than Adrian Fontes. Adrian Fontes, or maybe I can say Adrian Fontes. But so Adrian Fontes, it depends on...
Use that last one. My mom likes it best.
Adrian Fontes?
Adrian Fontes,
oh,
yeah.
Perfect. So Adrian Fontes is a Maricopa County recorder, and we're going to learn a lot. You know, it's interesting because in Spanish, in Mexico, you have el registro civil, where they register people who get married and many other things. So we really want you to help us understand in this conversation the recorder of what, right? So we're going to ask you a lot of questions.
Sure.
So again, first of all, Maricopa County recorder Adrian Fontes, welcome to our show, and thank you once again for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. I can hear the sound is perfect, and that's what I want because we're going to address a very important topic today.
Wonderful.
Perfect. All right, so I'll be asking you the questions, and then you obviously will be providing the answers. Let me just read a little bit. I always try to write something for the show, and this is what I wrote as an introduction. With the 2020 presidential elections in view, we've been addressing issues under the theme of democracy once a month, both in English and Spanish. We have addressed democracy in the three branches of government, in the educational system, in the healthcare system, and today we will address democracy in the voting process. To repeat what Abraham Lincoln said, democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So here's my first question to Adrian Fontes. Our special guest today is Adrian Fontes, Maricopa County recorder. Welcome, Mr. Fontes. One objective of the AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection, is to celebrate Latino accomplishments. So tell us, who is Adrian Fontes?
Well, he's a border town kid from Nogales who found himself in the big city at Arizona State. He enlisted in the Marine Corps and then went back and finished his undergraduate. He went to law school and learned a lot about the Constitution and its value in the everyday lives of people. And one day he got really, really angry because he saw people couldn't vote. They stood in line for hours and hours and hours, and then he decided to run for office, and his adventure led him to become the chief election administrator in the third largest voting jurisdiction in the United States of America, encompassing 2.5 million voters, 5 congressional districts, touching on 3 others, dozens of municipalities, several dozen school districts, water districts, sanitation districts, and we run elections in all of that stuff, not to mention the recording stuff that we do on the other side of the house as well. So here's a guy who found his way into elected office in an unusual manner, but I'm enjoying the heck out of it.
Yeah. You know, if I let you go with that, I mean, you already covered like what, 3, 4, 5 decades in one
almost 5
1 minute.
Almost 5
so
decades.
I can't let you go. Let's go deeper a little bit into your roots. So are you Mexican American? Your parents? Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So my roots go back in southern Arizona and northern Mexico. 350 plus years. Matter of fact, we've traced back. I've got an ancestor that heard a mass given at a muster at the Presidio in Janos, Chihuahua in 1695.
Amazing.
And he showed up with a horse, 2 mules, almost a dozen and a half rounds of shot. He had a saber and a hand knife and some other stuff. All of this is really well documented. My dad does a lot of that history stuff. And, you know, so mostly in northern Sonora. My grandfather was actually born in Naco, Sonora, just south of the border.
Right.
My great-grandparents were living in South Tucson at the time. And they wanted, this is in 1920, they wanted their kids to be Mexican citizens. And so they went south and went over the border and just barely made it. As you know, Naco's right on the border.
Right.
And they got his birth certificate there in Naco, Sonora. Well, he ended up becoming a U.S. citizen after serving in the Navy during World War II. And so, you know, he's part of that greatest generation. My folks are boomers. I boomer them once in a while, too, because, you know, you get to do that nowadays. But, yeah, so I've got deep, long roots down there. My mom's family, she's Pucci and Grimm. Folks who know Southern Arizona know the Pucci grocery store chain, the 4 brothers who had those stores down there. And then the Grimm family, of course, has been around for quite some time, descendants of the brothers Grimm, I think.
Right.
And so, you know, there's a lot of history there, and I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud to know of it. It's Italian and German and Mexican and Yaqui. My great-grandfather had to learn how to speak Yaqui in order to marry my great-grandmother. So there's a lot, you know.
You're a true mestizo.
Well, I'm a true American, right? Because we come from all over.
That's right.
And my roots are just as much dispersed throughout a multi-ethnic, multilingual diaspora as any other American, and so that's where I take my pride.
Before we go on to the first break, where does that mariachi, the love for mariachi and singing, come from?
Oh, my grandmother. Yeah, my grandmother, Artemisa Trujillo Fontes. She had a stroke when I was 5 or 6 years old. And so she didn't get out of the house a lot. And we had she had this big console stereo with the record player. And as a kid, you know, you'd go in Nogales, you'd go to your grandmother's house to hang out. That was daycare back then. And she would stand me next to this thing. And I know Cherry's laughing over here. And she'd put on, you know, like Lola Beltran. She would put on Marty Robbins records. She made me sing remember Debbie Boone had that song, You Light Up My Life? I used to have to sing that over and over and over again. But so just singing and the enjoyment of music has always been an important part of my life.
You know, it is extremely amazing to have in front of me a person that unites or gathers or represents so much, you know, culture. It's mind-boggling, you know, 2 languages, more than 2 languages within your family, the American culture, the Mexican culture. It is just unbelievable, you know, what you represent, and it is very, very amazing.
Well, it is the American story.
Right. That's precisely my point.
It is the American story. There's no,
my point.
You know, you get folks in the upper Midwest, for example, and they've got German and Finnish and Swedish. These are different languages, different cultures in and of themselves who settled in the same places. They may be a generation or 2 removed from it, and they may have melded into something a little bit different. But in many pockets, in many parts of the United States, I mean, the Cajuns in Louisiana are no less American than anybody else. Right. You know, you've got some folks, the Germans in Pennsylvania. Really, there's a lot of that still around, and we as Americans celebrate the idea that we are from a whole bunch of other places and from here too, right? Because there's a lot of native in all of us.
15 seconds to go on the break. How would you put all this that you just spoke to us in and say that this is democracy? Can we say that this is part of democracy?
Democracy is about is about bringing ideas together and coming up with one final idea.
And people.
And bringing ideas and people together and coming up
Amazing.
with a final idea. I could say that culturally, I'm the result of a whole bunch of different cultures, and I celebrate that as an American.
Thank you. Let's take our first break. Stay with us. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. The topic today, democracy in the voting process. Adrian Fontes is our special guest. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. The topic today is democracy in the voting process. Just by addressing these issues of democracy, I love democracy more. I know more about democracy than I did before. It's unbelievable. We've addressed democracy in the three branches of government, in the educational system, the healthcare system, and now in the voting process. So thank you again to Maricopa County Recorder Adrian Fontes for joining our show today. So here's another question, Recorder, and that is, would you mind taking us through the history of democracy in this country in the context of voting?
Oh, sure, but for that you got to go way back before we were actually an independent nation.
Okay.
So the idea of democracy is folks coming together with different opinions and making a choice as a group. Right, and so that takes many different forms. Back during the colonial times, we had company towns, and these companies were set up for profit, and folks would come over, they'd get a piece of land from the company, they'd invest in the company, and those were the folks who had a vote in the franchise. That's why we call voting a franchise. It traces its history back to the corporate structure, and that is, if you were a shareholder, you were a member of the franchise. If you were disenfranchised, that means that you sold it off or it was taken from you through some judicial process or extrajudicial process. And so that's one of the main reasons, and this is an interesting point that goes back to what you were talking about earlier. What does the county recorder do? Well, the county recorder is obliged by statute to create a names index, and that index is who owns which piece of land. Well, that index
goes
all the way back to who owns the property were the people that could vote. So the folks who were actually paying into the company, the taxpayers, if you will, because we didn't have income taxes or any of that stuff back then, those folks could make decisions about how those resources were being spent because all the money was going into this collective pool. And so that decision-making process continued forward. We took off the requirement that you had to be a landowner. Eventually, we took off the requirement that you had to be a man, right? Women were allowed the right to vote under the 19th Amendment back in 1920. We're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of that. We removed poll taxes. We removed the requirements for race. Finally, in the 60s, and all of our Native American brothers and sisters were finally completely enfranchised. And then we took off the age requirement of 21, reducing that down to 18, which was the age of the draft at the time. This was back in the 70s. And so there's a lot of opening the franchise and engaging in more and more and more people into this process. Interestingly, one of the things that we narrowed during our history that a lot of people are not aware of is the question of citizenship. You see, the question of if you're paying taxes, then you can vote. In fact, back, I think it was, I want to say 1870. I don't have this in my notes. But many of the states actually did not have a citizenship requirement. All you had to do was, be there and you had to register, and you had to, be there and be invested in the community. And it wasn't until 1926 in Arkansas was the last state to remove alien suffrage as a possibility. So in the last century, 1926 was the last time non-citizens were eligible to vote, and we became a nation where only citizens could vote as well. So we have a widening of the franchise and a little bit of a narrowing of the franchise. It's a mixed bag because that's what the United States is about. We've always shifted and changed, and the rules have never been the same. We tend towards opening it up, and that's an important part of the story. How we vote, the technology behind it, the way it's administered, things of this nature. You could go on and on for a long time about that. But generally the idea has always been and continues to be we want more people engaged in the process. And That's because we're recognizing the contributions of more people, whether they are financial or otherwise, and the rights inherent in the individual. Those are really being recognized as a part of the democracy.
I have a question. I don't have that question here, but I think what's your take, since you're linking, and not that you, but it's a fact that voting was linked to, land ownership, paying taxes. So the fact that some groups were not allowed to vote, do you see that more of an economic motivation, or were there's like the traditional interpretation is, there's racism here, there's racism there? What's your take on that? Was that more a little bit of both, or why would certain groups were not allowed to vote, and it was so gradual?
Well, I'm not an historian, and the theory of voting isn't something that specifically speaks to where I'm at. I'm an administrator.
Okay.
Right. I can follow the rules as they are now, but having gone through a CIRA certification and looked a lot at these issues from an academic perspective, I think the important thing to realize here is that existence of the shift and the tend towards inclusiveness.
Okay.
So why were certain restrictions in existence? There's a whole ton of reasons that could be behind that. Folks in power want to stay in power. It could be economic reasons. It could just be flat out racism. I mean, there's a whole bunch of possibilities.
Okay.
And you'd really have to be in the shoes of the folks at the time,
right,
to figure all that out with exactitude. But the reality is, in my view, what you look at are the set of values that have been practiced and have opened up, right? And what has shown itself to be true is that over history, it doesn't matter that it used to be this way, we've moved forward.
Okay.
And it doesn't matter that it used to be that way, we've moved forward. Not just because it was natural, but because people advocated for themselves and for others, because people fought against exclusiveness and tried to make inclusivity a part of the American mainstream, and that has succeeded continuously. And so to me, that's the more important thing, is how we've gotten to where we're at, where we've gone, not so much about why it was bad.
Got it.
Right?
Yeah. I hear you. Another thing that I would like to ask you is, in the past, when I heard the Secretary of State, I would have thought that they are the ones who basically run the elections. And basically, an interview that you did not so long ago, I learned that is not so. Can you explain to us what is the different the functions of each entity? You have the county recorders, and then you have the Secretary of State. Who does what?
Well, yes. So the Secretary of State is commonly referred to as the chief election officer in the state. And while they happen to be the chief regulator, they're not the chief administrator. So there's a big difference. So the regulator does what? Well, they make sure that everybody else follows the rules. And you have to have a separate entity to do this. Right, the Secretary of State produces the procedures manual that the governor and the attorney general look at and approve. That process is actually happening as we speak. Mm-hmm. The Secretary of State will come down to each of the counties and do logic and accuracy testing on our equipment. They will put on courses and certify elections officials across the state, which is actually happening right now. Down the street at our warehouse, we're hosting the Secretary. The Secretary herself is taking that course right now as we speak.
Interesting.
So she's got to go through the same thing everybody else does. The function of that office, however, is very different than the function of the county recorder's office or elections departments in Arizona. We're the ones who recruit and train the poll workers. We're the ones who find the polling places. We're the ones who design and execute the ballots. We're the ones who tabulate. We're the ones who do all the day-to-day functions of elections. We take care of our overseas voters. We do all the absentee balloting. We do all the signature stuff. So while the Secretary does have an important function, the Secretary is not the chief administrator of elections.
Okay.
They are the chief officer, but only insofar as regulation is concerned.
And obviously, we have 15 counties in Arizona. You are the recorder for the largest, Maricopa County. Obviously, for every county has its own recorder.
Yes, each of the 15 counties has its own set of constitutional officers. The recorder is one, just like the sheriff, the county attorney, the county assessor, and so forth. Each county has its own. Maricopa County is not just the biggest county in Arizona. Maricopa County is the third largest voting jurisdiction in the United States of America.
Right.
If we were a state, we'd be somewhere between Kentucky and Oregon in size. It is a massive undertaking for local officials here, and I think we do a pretty good job.
I have to say that perhaps L.A. County is the largest, maybe?
By a chunk, yes.
Okay, so L.A. County is the largest,
Right.
and I heard you said Houston, in the area of Houston, somewhere there.
For voting
The
jurisdictions,
second.
Harris County, which is the greater Houston area, is the second largest. Now, the reason Cook County doesn't go up that high is an interesting quirk of the fact that the city of Chicago versus the rest of Cook County is a separate voting jurisdiction. And they each have less voters than Maricopa County or Harris County. And so if Cook County was a unified jurisdiction, it would be the second largest behind Los Angeles County, and then Harris County, and then Maricopa. But because of that split there in Illinois, we get the number 3 spot.
Right. So let me just get my understanding clear here. So what the city council men are to the city, board of supervisors are to a county?
So the Board of Supervisors is like the legislative branch of county government. And the individual county-wide officers are the executive branch in their own areas. So I would be essentially the executive charged with preservation of records and elections administration. The sheriff is the executive regarding county law enforcement. The county attorney is the executive regarding prosecution and justice questions, and so on and so forth. So our countywide officers are akin to executive branch officers. The board doesn't supervise us. The board supervises all the rest of the agencies in the counties and approves our budgets. So we work together with them, but we don't work for them. We're kind of co-equal that way.
Do you think you brought in some new ideas, concepts to the board of supervisors in that relationship regarding voting and the whole process?
There's no question. There's been some innovation there.
I think that's part of another question, but it's fine if we can address it. We have a couple minutes. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, one of the things that we did was, the county recorder before me had been around for quite some time. 7 terms of the same person in the office really made folks very used to doing the same things over and over again.
Is that because no one ran, or was it a he or she?
It was she. Her name was Helen Purcell. She was
winning.
She was first elected in 1988, and the Democratic Party never ran anybody against her. So until I showed up, and it was an interesting dynamic, and there was far too much give from the board to the county recorder, and not enough of the supervision that you would expect to happen, not enough accountability. When I showed up, not only am I a member of the party of the minority, right, because it's a 4-1 Republican board and I'm a Democrat, so there was a lot more scrutiny on the office. But at the same time, I brought in an attitude that was 180-degree different insofar as the relationship with the voters is concerned. So I did bring a different perspective in that regard. Instead of waiting for folks to come to us for information, we started pushing information out. We used social media very heavily. We have Roundtable Project that's been very, very successful, reaching out to traditionally underserved communities. And really by pushing information out there, I think one of the things that we were very successful at was playing a part in the significant increase in turnout in the 2018 general election. That midterm saw a 42% increase in voter turnout.
43%.
42.4% over 2014, which is huge. And going into the 2020 cycle, we're expecting an even higher success rate if you're measuring by turnout. And so we're very excited, but we're bracing ourselves because it's going to be a big job. So working with the board the way we have has been occasionally challenging, but we've been paying close attention to the business of the people and trying to squeeze politics out as much as possible. And I think we've been successful.
Before we go on our second break, what would be, you think, something that they would point at in you that brought in an element of trust, an element of working together?
Well, I think the fact that we've avoided so many fights that we could have had. There's a ton of different ways that we work behind the scenes to compromise into something good for the voters, where we just didn't even look at the opportunities to fight publicly And that's important because good government doesn't always require people to stand up and scream and yell. Sometimes good government is just reasonable people sitting down, coming to an intelligent compromise that's driven by data and information.
Right.
And you put real on the table, and a lot of times you'll get smart people to agree regardless of their politics. And that's important.
Thank you. Let's take our second break. Stay with us. This is AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. The topic today, democracy and the voting process. We'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. If you have not done so, please find our page at AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection, Facebook, of course, and follow our page and help us to reach more people. I've said before that I would love to end the year with 2,000 followers. I think we're about 50 shy of that. It would be great to end the year with 2,000 followers. This is, we're making progress. We're reaching more people. Our special guest today is Maricopa County Recorder Adrian Fontes, or Adrian Fontes, however you want to pronounce it. He doesn't mind. And we are addressing democracy, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So we're bringing democracy to practical levels. I think I love the first segment, to be frank with you, because I saw democracy in your own life, in what you represent. I just saw it. It was a practical example, application of democracy. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? Ideas, mingling of people, bringing in the ideas, and folks who perhaps when you were going to high school, you never thought you would be running the elections,
No, nobody grows up to, as a kid thinking, I want to be county recorder when I grow up.
So only a government, a democratic government as a platform and foundation allows for anybody basically to participate.
Well, and I think the idea there is the idea of possibility, and possibility grows out of different perspectives and different views.
Right.
And at the end of the day, I see a lot of contention. I see a lot of politics and a lot of people saying, well, if it's not my way, it's the highway. Well, the reality is Americans really, really love elections. But we forget what elections represent. The idea of democracy and elections really means this. People with different views come together and have a competition about which ideas should win.
Wow.
It's a civil competition, right? We cast a ballot. So instead of playing soccer or football or baseball, we do it through balloting. But the main question underlying this is these are a very different set of ideas, different views.
Right.
That's natural to the American experience. And so what I like to talk to folks about a lot of times is it's okay if people think differently than you do. It's okay if we have different ideas. That's as American as it gets. There is no one American idea. If there was, we would never have elections. Right? So this is a fundamental question, is we're a place where many ideas grow, and the best ideas face off in a competition, and one wins and the other one gets another shot later.
I had heard you say that you're a lucky guy. Having born in Nogales, now you're running the elections in Maricopa County. How did you improve the process? What can we expect to see different from the elections when you first came on board on this position to what we saw in the last ones in the coming elections?
Well, let's hit the one that everybody remembers, because I think that's the most poignant election, right? And that was the presidential preference election in 2016, which ended up getting me into office in the first place. So if you go back 4 years to 2016, March 22nd, you remember people were standing in line for 3, 4, 5, some 6 hours. And the problem was a math problem. It was a logistics problem. We had gone from 2008, when both political parties had open races for president. Maricopa County had 400 polling sites for the presidential preference election, that primary. 400. The next time that happened, 2016, we had 60 polling sites.
Why?
Well, you're going to have to ask
Money
the prior.
issues?
You're going to have to ask the prior administration why. Mine isn't to ask why. Mine is to solve the problem.
Right.
At each of those 400 locations back in 2008, there were 2 check-in lines. But for the number of voters that we had then voting in person, which was far fewer than we had in 2016, it was sufficient. There were 800 lines. But by the time we got to 2016, we only had 120. So there was 120 opportunities for someone to check in, and that was totally insufficient. Well, that's 2016. In 2020, we're going to have more than 10 times as many check-in lines. And instead of just 60 locations, we're going to have more than 220 locations around Maricopa County. So the other important factor that folks need to realize is the Republican Party will not be on the ticket because when the governor called the election, which is his duty, the Republican Party had already withdrawn. Just like the Democrats did when Barack Obama was going for his second term, just like the Republicans did for George W. Bush, and the Democrats for Bill Clinton.
Let me interrupt you. I don't think I understand that. Can you try to explain it?
Easy to understand. If you're a political party, you want to protect your people. Okay? Right now, just like with Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, the president's party does not want to subject the president to a contested election. And they have the right to do that.
As a party. So they say we're not going to allow that so that nobody runs against our candidate.
That's exactly right.
That's
exactly right. That's the job of the party, is to help promote their candidate and their selection. And in this case, it happens to be Donald J. Trump. So they pulled out of the PPE, which is fine.
What is PPE?
That's the presidential preference election. Thank you for asking that. And it's a preference, and here's why. It's not a primary. Here's why. In Arizona's regular primary elections, which happen in August, the winner automatically goes to the general election ballot.
Right.
But in a PPE, there's a middle step. In the March presidential preference election, you still have to get past the convention that's going to happen in, I think it's in Minnesota or Milwaukee,
before
Wisconsin,
you can potentially go to the primary?
Before you get on the general ballot in November. So let's say, for example, Joe Biden takes Arizona for the Democrats. But when we get to the convention, Elizabeth Warren has more votes in the convention. Well, Joe Biden doesn't get onto Arizona's general election ballot because he's not the Democratic Party's nominee. Elizabeth Warren is. And so that's why for Arizona voters, it's a preference. So Arizona prefers this candidate over that candidate, but they don't automatically move forward. That's why it's called a preference and not an actual primary. It's a really interesting quirk of Arizona law, but that's just the way it works.
So that I gather that not all the states have this.
Oh, no. Some states have caucuses where you just got to show up on that day at that time, and it's kind of a head count, literally. Some states have other methods by which they send their delegates to the convention. Remember, in the presidential preference election on March 17th this year, where only the Democrats are going to be eligible to vote, we're sending our delegates to the Democratic National Convention. We're not picking a president. We're just sending Arizona's delegation for that candidate. And they can change the rules.
Can you have more than one candidate on the presidential preference?
You can have more than one candidate on the ballot, but only one can win.
Got it.
And Arizona is a winner-take-all state. And so it's not split up. Some states, for example, if you have 10 congressional seats, some states will split by proportion the number of delegates that get sent. So it's really a party function. It's a little convoluted and complicated. But the main thing for folks to know is this, back to your question, we're spending a lot more time and energy on resource allocation for voters to make it easier for voters, because it's the voters that matter under this administration. We want to make it easier for voters to vote. We want to be more transparent. We want to share more information. And that's why I'm sitting here talking to you. Although one of the other reasons why is because I was invited by Las Adelitas, who I know are a big part of this program. And so shout out to the ladies who are out there making a difference.
They help us produce the democracy themed shows. Yes.
Oh, well, they're wonderful. I know many of them, and I love them all.
Yeah. So what? So I don't know if I understand this right, but where do the independents come in this issue of the presidential preference elections?
Sadly, they don't.
So basically, if you register as a no party,
you can't vote in Arizona's PPE, but you can still vote in the regular primary in August.
So this would only apply in Maricopa to the Republican Party?
Nope. Statewide. This is a statewide
So my point
election.
is that the independents could not have a say in the presidential preference.
In the March
Right,
presidential
the March
preference
for the
election,
Republican Party.
independents are not eligible to vote. Republicans are not eligible because they withdrew. Libertarians don't have a candidate, so they won't be on the ballot. The Green Party has been decertified. So the March 17th PPE is only for members of the Democratic Party.
Got it.
And if someone wants to vote in that, they have to register as a Democrat before 29 days prior to the election.
This is important.
This is really important. So if you're listening out there and you want to vote for one of those Democratic candidates, whether you like them or not, you need to re-register and become a Democrat with my office at least 29 days prior to that election. And you can do that by either going to servicearizona.com, which is a great online voter registration tool. Arizona was the first state in the union to have online voter registration.
I use that.
You can go to your motor vehicle division location and do that, or you can find out where we're doing voter registration drives, find one of the political parties. At maricopa.vote, you can find more information about that.
There was something that Senator Martin Quesada was involved in. It didn't happen. What was that?
Oh, well, Martin and myself tried to... Well, Martin's been trying to open the PPE, the presidential preference election, up for independents, just like the regular primaries are as well. His bills never made it through the legislature. I introduced a piece of emergency legislation in the Democratic Party convention, hoping that my party would open up to independents and bring those voters in so that they could have a voice, because I think that's fair, and I'm still a strong advocate of it. But the Democratic Party disagrees with me on that, and that's okay. We disagree. And so it will remain a closed presidential preference election, and only Democrats are eligible to vote.
So this matter of the independence is kind of tricky, isn't it?
No,
because
it's not tricky at all.
I mean, you said that they have to register again to be able to vote.
Well,
That's the tricky
in
part.
that regard, it is tricky, but the reality is, look, and I think this is one of the flaws with the two-party system that we have, is that like with so many other things, the folks in power want to stay in power, and the political parties want to maintain that power to the exclusion of other voters. And that's the way this works. This is politics.
How can democracy change that?
Well, independents can vote for candidates that are willing to change it.
I got it.
You know, do some research. Talk to the folks that represent you in the state house or the state senate. Talk to your candidates because they're the ones that make the rules. Right? Not
each party.
And not me. I mean, you can talk to me, but I've already
So those
my mind
rules
made
are
up.
communicated to the Secretary of State eventually?
The rules become state statute, and that's the law. And right now the law says that independents, unfortunately, cannot vote, and they cannot pull a ballot for the presidential preference election in March. They've got to re-register before the deadline.
First time I understand that. Thank you very much. We're going to take our last break.
I'm glad I could help.
You're listening to AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. To stay with us. We'll be right back. Topic today, democracy and the voting process. We'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. The topic is democracy and the voting process. We only have a few more minutes. How about the security of our system? I mean, there was a lot of talk, especially, I want to say a couple of years ago, that our system is not secure enough and this and that and the other.
Well, there was a lot of talk yesterday in Congress about the security of our system.
Help us understand those concepts.
So there's a couple of aspects to security. Let me break it down very quickly. First and foremost, we can talk about physical security, right? You're talking about fires. You're talking about structural safety. You're talking about the security of the equipment not being stolen, things of this nature. So your basic physical security stuff. Then you've got your personnel security questions, and that is phishing attacks against your staff to steal their identities and thereby their IDs and stuff like that, so that they can infiltrate the system that way. Then you have your IT or cybersecurity, which is really kind of the information security parts. And that is somebody hacking into the system and diddling around in there. We have a protocol that covers all of that and then some. Mm-hmm. And so, but that's not really the biggest concern that we have. You know, when folks talk about foreign influence in our elections, they, to a degree, are talking about the attacks against our information systems and things of this nature. But the real problem that we have is the misinformation and disinformation campaigns. This is when people are sharing and liking things on Facebook and Twitter that are just not true. They're not utilizing those trusted sources of information for dates and times and for example, the types of ID you need to bring and things of this nature. And that's one of the reasons why we work very closely in collaboration with the Secretary of State's office, the Clean Elections Commission, and each of the county recorders and election departments around the state, and our website, maricopa.vote. We are the official word as to the time, place, and manner of your elections. And we're actually going to put that information out there as much as possible. And so the misinformation and disinformation campaigns are the biggest threats to the security of our elections.
Why?
Well, because, you know, let's assume for the moment that somebody cooks up a story that is absolutely not true about a candidate, and that story originated outside of the United States of America. You know, that's a real problem. That is foreign interference into our elections, and we want to do everything we can against it. That is misinformation. It is not true, and it comes from a foreign source. So that is direct foreign influence into our elections, and that's what a lot of people are very concerned about. Talking to people about the wrong dates, about the wrong deadlines, so that those voters, for whatever reason, are not eligible. Spreading falsehoods about sort of the manner with which the election happens, like which IDs are eligible to come and use at a polling place, for example. Those kinds of things are the biggest security threats we have. Now, the best fight against that is a well-informed electorate that actually casts a ballot, right? When we have a lot of people voting, when you talk to your friends and your neighbors about getting out there and actually going and voting, what you're doing is you're pushing a major part of the population into participating. That civic engagement raises everyone together, right? And so when there are less people voting, it's a lot easier to manipulate. When there are more people voting, it's a lot harder to manipulate. And so what voting actually does is it's an act of defiance against people who are fighting against our democracy. That's one good reason to get out there and vote. Being informed, right? Going to these different sources and doing a little bit of research, finding some trusted sources, and looking up the candidates and the issues are also very, very important. Our job isn't to tell you who to vote for, which party, or which issues to vote for. Our job is to inform folks about why voting is incredibly important. And you can make a really simple analogy using one of the programs that we've engaged with, which is participatory budgeting. So, you know, bringing it home to the individual voter is really important. So what are we doing with the school kids out there? Well, here's what we're doing. We engaged originally with the Phoenix Union School District. And what the superintendent out there did was Dr. Gaston, what's his last name? I think that's his last name. Anyway, he gave each of 5 schools several $1,000s. The bigger schools got like $10,000. The smaller schools got like $7,000. And what they did was they created a project using the participatory budget model, and they created different issue campaigns, and each of these campaigns competed against the other, and they had an election to decide how to spend the money. You know, and with high school students, people were like, oh, they're going to spend it on candy machines or, you know, soda pop at a football game. No, they were spending it on cold water dispensers, on shade structures for their campuses, on gardens so they could have, you know, fresh vegetables and learn about horticulture. The kids wanted really quality stuff. In fact, one of the schools, the kids voted for painting their bathrooms. And the superintendent came in and said, we're going to give you separate money to paint your bathrooms. Go for something else. Right. And so the idea here is that these kids, we're engaged in helping them figure out what to do with that money. Well, what do you think regular elections are for adults? Right. You pay taxes every time you buy a gallon of gas. You pay taxes every time you buy a loaf of bread, every time you buy a pair of sneakers for your grandkid, or you go to a movie. Those taxes go into a big pot, and guess who decides how to spend it? Elected officials like me,
Right.
the state legislature, the governor, the Congress. These folks are spending the money that you've already paid. Don't you think you want to have a say of who these folks are and what the priorities are? Well, guess what? If somebody has convinced you that your vote doesn't count or it doesn't matter, what they're doing is telling you, I'd rather have a bigger influence in spending your money than let you have an influence in spending your money. And that's one of the reasons why I get really passionate about getting more people voting and caring about it, because you either are working for that money or you already worked for that money. You're paying into this thing. You should have a voice in how it gets spent. And your ballot is your voice. And that's critically important for folks to realize.
So what I'm understanding is that the so-called mentally with the elections from other countries and infiltrating the systems is really non-existent. It's more the misinformation and sending the wrong messages about candidates and discouraging people from voting and giving the wrong perspective.
And it doesn't just happen from outside the country. I mean, in 2016, somebody made this ridiculous claim that several million illegal aliens voted. Well, that's just stupid.
Right.
And there's zero facts to back that up. But what did that effectively do? It eroded confidence in one of the best systems that we have.
Right.
You know, our elections are the golden thread that hold together this entire democracy. If we can't trust the outcome of our elections, we're screwed. And for people to be spouting these conspiracy theories and this nonsense, that is the misinformation and disinformation that is attacking our democracy. And so if you've got someone out there making spurious allegations, you look real carefully at the facts that they're backing it up with. Don't just look at the allegations.
Right.
Look for the facts. Look for the actual investigation. Look for the realness of the allegations. Now, sometimes there are folks that don't do great stuff in elections. That's true.
Right.
Sometimes you'll have someone who may vote in multiple jurisdictions. That's true too. But those instances are incredibly rare. Incredibly rare. And for folks to be making allegations about all these other things that are happening, it erodes our system, and it's dangerous for our democracy. That's the biggest threat we've got right now, is these conspiracy theories.
Got it. We are only a couple more minutes, 3 minutes. Would you help us understand this would be my last question. The voting, who gets to vote, how do we vote, when do we vote, especially that voting by mail, which I think is one thing that you
voting by mail is one of the best things in the world. And I'll tell you, I came around to this. All right, I was originally not a fan, and then I realized what it meant to voters and
you got
why
converted.
Well, I looked at the facts, and I looked at the actual information. And instead of going with anecdote and with my gut, I went with facts and data. And guess what? I came around to what 85% in some elections of our turnout is ballot by mail, early ballot. 85%.
That is a high percentage.
Think about that. In the that was in the primary in 2018. In the general election, when you had tens of thousands more voters in Maricopa County, maybe 100,000 more or more, it was still over 80% of the turnout. Now think about that. 8 out of 10 voters are not going to a polling place to vote. Now, why is that? Because it's easier, it's more secure, and it's less expensive. If you can't get on board with something that's easier, more secure, and less expensive, then there's something going on there. And here's the number one thing that it is. People just aren't aware of it.
Right.
When you look at the increase in our voter population over the last 10 years, and you look at the percentage of increase of people getting an early ballot, that second percentage is going up faster, which means that even though people are moving here from other places and coming of voting age, more and more and more of them are getting on the permanent early vote list. And if I had my way, I would say we should go all ballot by mail across the entire state because guess what? It's more convenient, it's more secure, and it's less expensive. And who doesn't want that?
Polling places would be a minimum.
Well, they would exist, of course. You have to have a place to replace ballots if your dog eats it or you spill coffee on it. That's obviously always going to happen. You got to have somewhere to drop them off. If you don't want to put it in the mail, that's fine too. So people will still be able to vote in person, but the vast majority of folks who are voting aren't going to polling places. And guess what? I still have to hire people. I still have to have trucks to ship everything out. I've got to secure all this equipment. I've got to deal with all of the logistics and personnel issues and insurance issues and everything else that goes along with the assumption that we're going to have 100% turnout at the polls. But that's not true. So I'm just throwing money away with this old model that the vast majority of our voters have rejected. And, I mean, if that's the way folks want to spend their tax dollars, that's okay. But I don't have to necessarily agree with it.
How do you evaluate, or what emotion does that generate in you to see organizations, be it LULAC or Chicanos por la Causa or whoever, doing voter registration? Is that encouraging to you?
No, absolutely. I think everybody should be. I mean, I think we should have authentic voter registration. And some people call it automatic voter registration. I think that's a nonsense term. It's authentic voter registration because it is a lot easier, better, and more secure and less expensive to go through the variety of databases that we already have access to verify the identity of a person and add them automatically onto the voter rolls.
Right.
It is far less expensive than processing paper, which is what we do now. And guess what? We're actually grabbing the real folks. We've got the data right now to have much more accurate voter rolls at a much lower cost. But for some reason, people don't want to do the more efficient, more effective, and more secure thing. Again, it's frustrating when you're dealing with folks who don't deal in data. They deal in mythology. And, it is what it is.
Maricopa County Recorder Adrian Fontes, thank you so very much for joining our show. This is all the time we have. Thank you so much.
But I think I'm coming back to do it in Spanish soon.
I think so.
All right, let's do that.
And thank you for joining us today. This is all the time for now. See you soon. Take good care of yourselves. Bye-bye.